Teleshikues të Alb UK TV, mirë se vini në programin Zeri Diasporës. Me ju sonde kam zonjushen Ajshe Pllana, njohse mirë politikës ndërkombëtare, e cila studioi në Harvard University, raportet mes Shteteve të Bashkuara me Middle East apo shtetet e lindjes së mesme, dhe kemë në emisionin tonë për të na njoftuar pak më shumë në lidhje me ngjarjet që ndodhi pas vrasjes së generalit Qasim Soleiman, cilin me vështirësi për ja thëmë edhe emrin, dhe çfarë ndryshuan prej periudhës kur u bë marrëveshja me Barack Obamën dhe Shtetet Bashkisë Evropiane për armë nukleare, për jo prodhimin e tyre nga Irani, dhe çka ndryshoi pas ardhjes së Donald Trumpit dhe si do qaset tani me këto ngjarjet e fundit që vetë sa ndodhen edhe janë duke ndodhur derisa ne flasim. Zonja Pllana, faleminderit, zonjusha Pllana, në fakt faleminderit që na erdhët në emisionin tonë.
Faleminderit, mirë se ju gjeta të gjithëve, urimi vit i ri.
Urime dhe juve, shpresojmë se ky vit i ri do të filloj pak më mirë se sa që do të vazhdoj pak më mirë se sa që ka filluar. Tek raportet Shtetet Bashkuara të Amerikës me Iranin tashmë veç janë në një krizë thellë pas vrasjes të Qasim Soleimanit. Pak më në hollësi, kush ishte Qasim Soleimani dhe pse ishte një target që Shtetet Bashkuara të Amerikës mendon, apo në këtë rast Donald Trump urdhën e tij mendon që po ta hekshin atë do ndryshojë situata dhe si do të ndryshojë, si mendoni ju? And you can go in English, obviously.
Okay. General Soleimani, he was a key figure in Iran, as we are beginning to understand now, even though he was largely unheard of until recently. As Joe Biden stated today, he was probably the second most important figure in Iran. He led a coalition against the global and American-led coalition in the Middle East. And he is said to be responsible for over 600 deaths of Americans, so America has considered him an enemy. However, now the question has remained, was this the correct decision by the Trump administration to attack and kill General Soleimani, because he was a key and prominent figure, as I said, in Iran. So Iran, as we saw last week, there were protests. Protesters took to the street to protest his death because they saw this as an act of war when taken by the U.S. toward Iran.
How did he become the second figure in Iran? What kind of route he took it to become as powerful as that? Knowing that somehow when he was 20, he was quite senior in the army.
Right. Well, as I said previously, we really haven't, the American public hasn't really been made aware of his presence prior to his killing. So he went largely unnoticed, unheard of, except amongst American politicians. The American public did not know very much about him. However, he is said to be a very prominent figure. He rose through the ranks, and Ayatollah Khamenei favored him to be the next leader of Iran. He led the coalition in Iran, but also in surrounding countries like Iraq. And then also he is said to have deployed about 50,000 militia officers, as well as financial and weapon backing to the president of Syria. So he, for the Middle Easterners who believed that the U.S.-led global coalition was invading their space, he was viewed as a hero by Iranians, and people in Iraq and Syria who thought that the West and the U.S. was penetrating their native lands.
if you can help us, or if you can take us back to the Iran history or crisis in Middle East that are for quite long been there. How did the Iran came to the point that he was restricted on economic sanction quite a few years now, and there was a deal made, and then even after deal that we have to come to this point that action has been taken, you kind of without any kind of notice.
Yes, so I can provide a little bit of background just in this amid the war on terror. So what has happened, what has been created in the Middle East is now a strategic competition for regional leadership. And so now Iran on one side, Saudi Arabia, of course, Israel, they are all kind of competing for regional leadership because there are a lot of wars going on, and especially in the war in Syria, there are many people. There's many wars by proxy. There are many people fighting there to gain and maintain power in the Middle East. So with Iran being one of the bigger countries in the Middle East, and Iran is a formidable opponent in the Middle East because it's a large country and it has military capabilities that are prominent and unmatched in the region. Well, perhaps with Israel, but they remain unmatched. So Iran has been considered an enemy of the United States for that reason. They are going against the United States and Western-backed coalitions to maintain. For example, Iran has single-handedly helped the president of Syria maintain power in the region, and then because of that, Iran has become a target for the U.S. and for the West because it is challenging its foreign policy objectives. Now, the 2015 Iran deal it was largely led by President Barack Obama, but European states were also co-signers. This removed the economic sanctions that were placed by the Western states and by the U.S. on Iran that was really crippling their economy, in exchange for Iran promising to halt its enrichment of uranium, and it also allowed international inspectors to go into the country. So basically, it prevented them from creating nuclear weapons. Once President Trump came in May of 2018, he exited that deal, which for the first year, Iran largely maintained calm, but after a while, President Trump, in addition to exiting the deal, he also exerted maximum pressure, as he said in his words, by imposing economic sanctions on Iran and also imposing economic sanctions against nations that were purchasing oil from Iran. So this was very crippling to their economy. I think it's about 20% unemployment rate in Iran. So, it was doing damage to their economy, and they started attacking U.S. bases in the Middle East. And just the last week of 2019, they attacked a base in Iraq, and unfortunately, they killed a U.S. contractor. That is when the U.S. responded by killing General Soleimani, and then we saw the attack from Iran to U.S. bases in Iraq. And this is the latest development so far.
Let's go back to the execution of Qasem Soleimani. After that, we have the rockets being fired into the American bases, to my knowledge, in Iraq. Thank God there's no casualties there. And also the airplane came down. I think it's Ukrainian airplane with quite loads of Canadian
Yes.
passengers there. How that, and sound like from the information I'm gathering, it's that already some kind of crisis started with the Iran. Do we expect that those movements is leading towards some kind of internal revolution, or whatever you're calling, to actually try to bring the government down?
Well, one thing that we have seen with Iran that is different, for example, from Iraq or Afghanistan, once General Soleimani was killed, his successor was right away replaced by Ayatollah Khamenei. So this shows that there is some strategy to their leadership. You know, for Libya, for example, once Gaddafi was killed, it kind of became turmoil, people vying for power, people fighting with each other. This was not the case in Iran. So this shows that there's some stability there. But on the other hand, I think there has been, well, everyone is a bit confused as to what is happening, because first, just as you said, it's been quite a start to the new year for them. First, there were some protests against Americans. Then there were protests because General Soleimani was killed. Now there are protests by Iranians that are taking to the streets because the Ukrainian jet plane was shot down. So I think it is probable to assume that the Iranians are taking to the street because they don't want the West to think that this was intentional, or that the Iranian people wanted, the killing of these civilians on the airplane, because they are afraid that the West will attack, and they will start a war similar to Iraq or Afghanistan or similar nations that have suffered really a bad fate in the past 20 years or so.
If we look at the Middle East or Iran, the neighborhood around, it's already trouble, like Iraq, Syria, I think it's Yemen. What do you think? What we expect if, in case, it's gonna go to some kind of revolution or trouble, that the government will come down, which in the country that is 80 million people? How do you think that kind of number of people or that kind of size of country can be managed, and how endangered are the neighbors around, first of all, and the rest of the world, which kind of is in question of how to take the next steps with it?
Yes, that is definitely the worst case scenario and extremely concerning. Already these protesters that are condemning the shooting of the plane, they are calling for Ayatollah Khamenei to step down, which again is, just like the Arab Spring protests began. They took to the streets in surrounding nations to ask for the leadership to step down, and then these protests grew into full-blown wars. So we have seen this pattern before, and it would be a concerning pattern. However, so far, it does not seem that it is heading that way. The Iranian leaders have accepted blame. They accepted that it was unintentionally, that the Ukrainian jet plane was unintentionally shot down. Today, I did see the reports that someone was arrested, which hopefully will calm the protesters. And on the other hand, especially because there were about, I believe 63 Canadian passengers on the plane, they, Justin Trudeau today came out and in the past few days has also, asked exactly how much at blame was President Trump's administration, shooting or coercing Iran by killing General Soleimani, Obviously, people in Iran were riled up, concerned, scared, and in those cases, people are not their most rational selves. So people, not just in Canada, but in Europe also, are questioning, how much of the blame belongs to the U.S.
How is the situation now in the United States after all these kind of actions, those kind of deal that we're calling Barack Obama's deal, in this case, to make it easier to understand that there was done with the support of European Union and some other countries. Then, as you said, the Donald Trump decided it wasn't the right deal, so he kind of went to actually come out of deal. Now we got Republicans and Democrats, they actually accusing each other whether it was a good deal or not a good deal, whether the assassination of the general was right or wrong. And then suddenly we have in the US Congress, they kind of came together to actually take some of the power from president, not to be able to continue with that. How are we finding this kind of division in the country for actions that has been taken in the Middle East, knowing that it's a quite sensitive environment already there?
It is. Well, to say that the environment is sensitive here, especially during these impeachment proceedings, is undermining exactly how sensitive it is. So there's definitely tension between Republican and Democratic congressional leaders now. I think the main problem with President Trump exiting the Iran deal is that he has not replaced it with anything else. The Iran deal, whether perhaps it wasn't perfect, but it was effective in maintaining Iran so that it wouldn't produce nuclear weapons. Everyone was kind of at peace, for Iran, that meant that the sanctions were removed, so their economy was improving. So it was effective in keeping calm between the two nations, between the US, between the United States and Iran, and European nations as well. And that is the main problem. President Trump exited that deal, exerted a lot of pressure on Iran, which many believe was undue pressure because they were abiding by this nuclear deal. They did not, break out of the deal. It was the U.S. President Trump did not replace it with anything else. So for congressional leaders, even though, most Republicans have fallen in line with President Trump and said, oh, maybe it wasn't a perfect deal, they are unable to answer their Democratic counterparts when they ask, where is the replacement? What is the plan? And I think that is the question that is that they have been unable to answer, that there is no plan. They've exited this deal and it would just kind of place these sanctions, made it more difficult for Iran and have nothing in its place. And yes, so the Democratic leaders this week, they proposed a resolution to make an amendment to the War Powers Act of 1973, which limits, it's a congressional resolution which limits the president's power to go to war. So for President Trump, he launched a couple of strikes in Iran, but in order for it to become a full-blown war, he would require for Congress to approve funding for the war. And Democrats this week were able to, earlier this week, they were able to pass this resolution. And, surprisingly, a few Republicans also signed to this resolution. I think the consensus is that most Americans and definitely European countries, they don't want to go to war. They don't want the U.S. and Iran to go to war.
The decision on Congress that was voted against, for removing some of the power from the president, I think, to what I heard, it's advisable rather than compulsory. Is that right to say it?
Yes. Yes, this is true because Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, she did not want. Typically, how American bills are made is that a bill is introduced in the House and then goes to the Senate and then goes to the President's desk to be signed. And Nancy Pelosi did not want this to go, obviously, to the White House because she knew this would not be signed and approved by President Trump.
How is the general public mood onto this kind of environment? If you can have any opinion on it, or media, have they brought it up? What the opinion of the people itself is on those kind of actions?
I think most people are tired of war. I think the war in the Middle East, what American politicians initially believed would be a few months, an excursion for a few months, has turned into a 20-year, multi-trillion-dollar war. So most people, I think, even though they have learned about General Soleimani, that perhaps he was an enemy of the United States, they are very unlikely to support the war in Iran simply because it would be too costly.
Now, when any event that happened in the Middle East, the United States always cooperated with the European Union countries, especially Great Britain, Germany, and France. In this action, there hasn't been seen much of the support from those countries. We just recently we heard that there was a meeting went on, and Boris Johnson, the best could suggest it's let's make another deal to call Trump's deal, if that makes someone happy, to actually get involved the European countries to help calm down the situation. Have you heard, what do you think about this kind of situation altogether? Do you think America is alone in this case, or do you think they kind of still have a support around?
Yes, well, like I said, I think people, not just in America, but in Europe as well, have grown weary of wars. I remember, for example, when President Obama tried to gain backing from U.S. Congress and then from the European counterparts to launch attacks against Assad. Remember his red line, his famous red line, and he did not get congressional approval, nor did he get the backing of European states. And I remember the British Parliament cited misinformation given in the Iraq War as the reason not to go into Syria. And again, I think now, people are wary of war. They do not want to engage in another war that could potentially span for another 10, 15 years. And for Boris Johnson, I did hear that just today he was speaking, I think all European leaders, because they don't want to go to war, because they want to avoid another Iraq, they want a replacement deal for the Iran deal signed in 2015 that President Trump exited in 2018, and consequently then Iran also exited the deal. So I think everyone is eager, European leaders. It's not just Boris Johnson. I know that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and Angela Merkel and Japanese leadership also stepped in to try to mediate the tensions between the White House and Tehran because they don't want another war. I think everyone wants this to de-escalate.
I mean, you're very well aware of Middle East kind of way that work, and kind of making sure that their decisions show to their own people that actually are tough decisions on favor of their people. Considering that Iran has been in sanction for a very long time, Iraq starved from the war, you got Syria in the similar situation, Yemen. So we're looking at kind of quite a few countries that are in high poverty. Do you think part of the sanctions, I mean, if you can give this personal opinion, not necessarily on some kind of analysis, but do you think that those economic sanctions, it would help that kind of environment to actually calm them down, or do you think it make it worse?
Well, it is, many studies show.
Seem like, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Okay. Studies overwhelmingly show that economic sanctions against nations do not work. They are not effective. One is that President Trump, for example, he tweeted in the past 2-3 days to the Iranian people saying that he backed them since the beginning of his presidency. But Iranian leaders could go back and say, if he backed the Iranian public so much, why did he impose such tough economic sanctions that the country is suffering from? So you can really turn those around. You have to be careful with economic sanctions. As far as I know, the best sanctions work when they are targeting either an individual or an organization, where, for example, the Islamic State, would not be able to receive funding or something to that extent. But economic sanctions imposed against nations, they are usually ineffective and counterproductive.
We have now soon, we're expecting the elections in United States. How the opinions or media or if any measurements is showing whether Democrats are advancing or Republicans, although the Democrats are in the middle of finding their own leader at the moment?
Yes, right now I would say it is too early to tell, who will be the front runner for the Democratic team. It seems that most polls show Joe Biden leading the pack, but it is entirely too early to tell. For example, tomorrow the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate. There may or may not be a trial. I think, this is just a bit too early to tell. It's really a bit chaotic more than other years. Of course, it's not often that the U.S. has impeached the president. This is actually only the third time in the history of the United States that a president has been impeached. So we will see where this leads us.
We got Donald Trump that came as someone who knew how to present himself and how to actually hold a meeting and tell the people what they want to hear, and actually showing himself as a good deal maker in a previous election. Do you think that that kind of ability going to help him this time to actually win the election again? Apart from if you think there is something that the people like what he did?
I think the number one factor that would affect his win or loss, but really, in terms of speaking of whether he has chances to win, is that what we see about the Republicans that is quite different from the Democratic Party is that they vote in line with the party. They don't break away, even though they disagree with President Trump or they condemn his actions. Still, the majority of the time, they vote in line with President Trump. So this has been a good strategy for the Republican team. Whereas for Democrats, it's a bit more scattered, energy is scattered, and they are a bit more combative with one another. So probably not as inclusive as the Republican Party.
Now, the attention of Western world, it's quite a lot. If I don't say the whole world, it's quite loads on Middle East during those crises, and certainly new dialogue that's going to take place, whatever that happen, how that it's reflecting on the energy of Western world being focused in Middle East and maybe kind of forget about Balkans for the moment, which we know that we're waiting for the very tough negotiation and deal making between Serbia and Kosovo and region itself.
Is this taking attention away, especially in the United States? Yes, definitely. Many people have questioned President Trump's timing of the killing of General Soleimani. This is happening in the middle of the impeachment proceedings that, many have accused him of wanting to take attention away from the impeachment and shifting it to the Middle East. Whether this was true or not, whether this was his intention, this has definitely shifted attention there. And as far as taking away attention from the Balkans, this is entirely possible, and it may continue this way, especially, until after the election. So we'll see. And if President Trump is elected again, then it will probably be another 4 years after that. One thing about President Trump, he has maintained that he does not wish for the U.S. to be the world's policeman any longer. He wants to retreat and, put the country first, as he says. So he does not want his attention to be spread around the world. Perhaps maybe the Middle East, because he has this clear view that he believes they are terrorists and he must go after them. But as far as the negotiations that are coming up, between Serbia and Kosovo, I think the United States' attention has definitely been shifted toward the Middle East, toward the impeachment. So for Kosovo, that may mean bad news for now. Yes, this is realistically, assessing the situation.
European Union has been shaken in the last 4 or 5 years towards the last 4 or 5 years because of the kind of unstable governments around, and certainly Brexit, or when Great Britain decide to come out. There is a new administration now in European Union that is settling, and they kind of seem to be quite well organized, as they showing by talking, not necessarily by action yet, because they are just there now. What do you think about the United States, especially Trump's administration, knowing that hasn't been backed up in those kind of decisions without judging them whether wrong or right? Do you think that at some point they're going to say, well, you deal with your problems in Europe then by yourself, because you did not support us in Middle East, we can't support you in Europe? Do you think that we could come to any kind of question at any time soon?
Yes, well, I believe that, President Trump has kind of maintained that thought process even before this Iran catastrophe in the past 2 weeks or so. I saw an article that when Angela Merkel called President Trump to suggest that she can help mediate the discussions between the White House and Iran, he joked with her and he said, oh good, well now Germany can take over in Iran in the Middle East. So really President Trump wants to remove, he wants to pull it, rein the powers back in. He does not want the attention of the U.S. to be spread out, and certainly for European countries, as he has long maintained that they must contribute to NATO more financially. I think he wants them to be more independent, which in the long run for Europe, this may be beneficial, because I don't think they can expect to always be dependent on the U.S.
Yeah, I understand that. when we talking, I mean, the painful thing is when everything happened around Kosovo, Albania, and countries in Balkans, because that is where the First World War starts, Second World War, and certainly it's a sensitive place. Now, we found that when the United States is not involved into those kind of problems, the problems are never resolved by Europeans. That it's a history had told us. So in this case, if the United States or Donald Trump administration for one reason or another, because Donald Trump seemed to be, as everyone says, a deal maker. If you don't do this for me, I don't do that for you, as simple as. And it's crystal clear what he wants and what he can do for you. So he make it quite clear to every one of the friends or enemies, if I put that way. Do you think that would come the administration of Donald Trump, if continue to be for another 5 years in power, going to bring the European Union to that point to say, well, this is the conditions. If you kind of put up with us, we will do for you, but otherwise you deal with your own problems, which then we are in uncertainty, I would say.
I think that is a definite possibility with Donald Trump. I mean, as we see him, he has long maintained that Europe needs to pick up slack. In his words, as he has said it, he needs to, that European nations need to contribute financially, militarily, that but they need to step it up, because he does not want to be the backbone of European nations. And for example, in Kosovo, when the intervention took place, it was a U.S.-led NATO intervention. So without the U.S. leading NATO into the intervention, it probably, would not have taken place. So Europe has been quite dependent on the U.S. taking a leadership role. And that may have to shift, especially if Donald Trump wins re-election, that would definitely have to shift.
What do you think we as Albanians we should do during this kind of periods, that it's quite a question timing, that US and European power has been focused in the Middle East, and we don't know for how long, because it started like that, but we don't know yet, and they don't know how long it's going to last for those kind of crises. What do you have an idea of what Albanian government, Kosovo government, and the region governments should do about this to actually have some kind of success out of those crises, rather than going back to where we were 20 years ago?
Yes, I like the idea that is floating around about the Cold Peace between, this is a play on words from the Cold War, but the U.S. and Russia, they simply try to avoid going to the brink of war and try to maintain peaceful relations whilst, the negotiations were taking place. So I think that this is the first step for Kosovo, is to, make sure, for Kosovo and Serbia, is to kind of, try to maintain that peaceful relations for now, whilst these nations are dealing with these other problems like the Middle East. As we have seen, in the Middle East, for Iran, for example, previously America went into Iraq, into Afghanistan, and other nations. They were able to kind of steamroll over these nations, but Iran, because they were well prepared, even with military capabilities, America backed off a little bit. As Iran said, we do not wish to escalate a war, but we will keep going if we must. We will defend ourselves. And I think, going back to Kosovo and Serbia, whilst these tensions are taking place around the world, I think, the strategy that Kosovo should develop is that first we we have to strive to maintain peaceful relations simply because American attention is shifted elsewhere at the moment. And second, develop strategies that, what we could do in worst case scenarios to be prepared for negotiations and, militarily too, otherwise.
Once more, I have to take back before we end we came to the end of the interview. Can you just help me to understand a little bit about the NATO? Whether the NATO, do you think, is getting stronger or is going weaker since those kind of relation hasn't gone in the right direction, considering that Turkey had pulled out, well, did not pull out, let me not take by this, but in a way sided with Russia rather than with United States and Western world, when in fact it's still member of NATO?
Yes, this is a concerning pattern because now, as we've discussed previously, the US is really no longer leading NATO to the extent that it was previously. And with Turkey's disassociation from NATO to the extent that it has taken, this is a concerning pattern. I think NATO is becoming weaker in the eyes of many people in many nations. Although I think European leaders, they do see a danger in this, and for the past 2 years, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, and Angela Merkel have voiced opinions for creating this European army that would complement NATO. So whilst, there are some damaging aspects taking place that hinder the military capabilities of NATO, on the other hand, it is pushing European nations to come together and come up with a strategy, come up with a plan of what would be the next step should these nations pull out entirely.
Now that we are at the end of the interview, we may kind of just consider that your information is going to be very valid to our TV watcher, people who are watching us. Can you just help us do you have to say anything or any message to Albanians that watching us at this point in time? Whether it's government, politics, or nations itself. Diaspora, certainly.
Oh, you know what? I think that for the diaspora especially, I hope that
you can say this in Albanian if it, as probably most Albanians, they want to hear in Albanian.
Well, I mean, I'll just say it very quickly. I think especially for people living abroad, the most effective that we can be. Sorry.
You came back live again.
I apologize. We had a bad connection. I think the most effective that we can be is by lobbying to our hosting governments and to protect Kosovo, to really rally around Kosovo. We can all, even if we go as individuals in the U.S., we can go to our congressional leaders, but we can go to other organizations as well, and really, ask that our leaders protect and defend Kosovo.
Well, if you do you have to say anything for the end, or you think that we have covered quite a lot, which I believe we did?
I think for now I have covered most of what I wanted to say.
Well, you're fantastic, and thank you so much for joining us from United States. And we shall keep in touch, and we see how the situation in United States and Iran evolve, well, in Middle East as well. And hopefully everything is going to be resolved as fast as possible, so we have a job to do down in Balkans and Kosovo to bring the peace to the end, to begin the peace and end all these conflicts that had happened 20 years ago and more than that.
I hope so. I have the same wishes, and hopefully this tension with Iran will de-escalate, and we can have a more peaceful 2020 than the beginning has been.
Zonjusha, më falë, pra po thamë, Pllana, faleminderit shumë edhe njëherë për kohen, dhe shpresoj që do shifme në emisionit arshme dikun, që ndoshta do ta shqyrtojmë njëkohësisht ndryshimet që ndodhin pastaj.
Faleminderit shumë.
Ju përshëndes natën e mirë. Teleshikues të Alb UK TV, ishte një intervistë e cila pak a shumë tentuam të marrim sa më informata të hollësishme prej një ekspert dhe njohëse të mirë të çështjeve të lindjes së mesme, raportet e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës me Iranin, kaluam edhe pak, apo me kërkesat e mia kaluam edhe pak në ndryshimet në Evropë dhe përkrahja apo jo përkrahja e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës për aksionet që u morën në herën e fundit e çka do mendojmë na që do ndryshon në të ardhmen, se sa vështirësitë në lindjen e mesme shkaktojnë problemet që fokusi të orientohet tani më shumë se sa ka Ballkani. Çështja e popullatës së Kosovës, udhëhecëve, politikanëve të tjerëve, mendojmë që mos pritum kohë të madhe edhe kohë gjatë që gjithmonë historia të punojnë në favor tonin, po ta shfrytëzojmë momentin, hapin që sa më shumë të ecëm përpara që të jemë një shtet edhe një kombë solid që e ndihmon paqen në Ballkan e jo domosdoshmërisht që të shkaktohemi gjithmonë apo ta shohim veten si viktimë. Për sonte, unë Sabri Agimi nga Zëri Diasporës, natën e mirë, miru pafshëm në emisionet e ardhshme.